Welcome back, it's Smashboss here, and today's video is going to be a little bit different because this video is not going to be about Super Mario Maker 2. Instead, since there are rumors that there will be a new Nintendo Direct this week, I really hope to hear some new information about two of the games that I'm most hyped for that have already been announced. And those are Breath of the Wild 2 and Splatoon 3. So for each of those videos I will make a dedicated video where I go over the top 10 things that I'd like to see in those games. And after that I will of course also make something like that for a Mario Maker 3 game. Even if it hasn't been announced yet, I still hope it will be at some point in the near future. So today's video is going to be about Breath of the Wild 2, and the first thing that I'd really like to see in the next Breath of the Wild game would be a more challenging fighting system, especially in the later parts of the game when your armor and your hearts and whatever is upgraded to the maximum level. A lot of fights are not challenging at all anymore. I really think the only challenging enemies in the later parts of the game are Lionels. And of course, upgrading your armor or getting more hearts is a procedure that I wouldn't change because it makes sense. You get stronger if you do certain challenges in the game. But there are other systems in the game that in my opinion also play into that. And those can be changed to make it better, I think. So first of all, something that just naturally occurs if you play the game, you get better at it. And you also realize and predict the enemy attacks and their patterns. And I think for Breath of the Wild, those are quite easy to predict. So also, most of the enemy's attacks are rather slow, so most of the time you can probably hit the enemy 4 or 5 times before they can even hit you once. And there are just a lot of little things about the enemies that they are not always the smartest, and that there are a lot of systems that help you kill the enemies with ease. For example, another thing is that slow motion effect that you have when you pull out the bow in mid-air. And I think this is also pretty overpowered the way that it is done in Breath of the Wild 1. So what I'd really like to see in the next game is smarter enemies, faster enemies that are less predictable. And maybe also I would change that slow motion effect so that you can only fire one single arrow in that slow motion period, and then it auto ends the slow motion. Because I think one reason why this slow motion effect is very overpowered is that you can literally hit the enemies over and over and over again from one slow motion. Another thing that I change about the fighting system is that in Breath of the Wild you can eat any amount of food and any effects or whatever in the middle of a fight. I think as soon as enemies are nearby, you shouldn't be able to eat food or whatever anymore. Also, I think changing weapons or basically anything that you have to go into the menu for should require some time. Maybe even the menu shouldn't cause the actual gameplay anymore, because for the enemies it takes time to regain health, for example in master mode, or the enemies in rare occasions they can also eat food, but they cannot do that basically instantly, because for them this takes real time in the game. As for you, you can hit the pause button and then the enemies can do nothing, and you can just upgrade yourself to whatever you want in the meantime. So I think it should either be completely impossible to eat food or whatever during a fight, or it should be done in a way that you cannot just pause and eat food in this pause mode, but you would actually have to run away far enough so that you can eat food in the time until the enemies get to you. But the way it is now, I think it's really too easy. Also, something that I wouldn't allow is that you can just teleport out of a fight in the middle of the fight. That's also something that I would completely disable when enemies are nearby. And I think if you just tweak all those systems a little bit in the right direction, it would really improve the fighting system for the next Breath of the Wild. Moving on to the next point, what I kind of missed in Breath of the Wild was the classical dungeons from other Zelda games like Wind Waker, because I think the Divine Beasts from Breath of the Wild didn't really feel like a classical Zelda dungeon, and I prefer the classical dungeons. I mean, I generally liked the idea of having those rooms that you could turn around and stuff like that to solve puzzles. However, the general structure of those Divine Beasts that were mostly just made out of puzzles but didn't have that much of enemies or fighting. Also, in all of those dungeons in previous Zelda games, there was always the dungeon item that you could get in that dungeon, and from then on you could use it to solve puzzles all around the world. And due to its open world nature, Breath of the Wild was designed so that when you leave the Great Plateau, you would have all abilities that you need to solve all puzzles everywhere in the world. However, I would still like to see some kind of backtracking, at least for optional areas and secrets in the game, because being able to solve literally any puzzle, no matter where you are, immediately kind of also felt boring, because it always is kind of interesting to me, for example in Metroid games, to find this new area where I see I need some ability that I do not have yet and come back there in order to solve the puzzle later on. And I just didn't have that in Breath of the Wild. So of course the general structure is still an open world game, and I would also keep that. But I think for some optional secrets and areas of the game that are not part of the main story, it would make sense to include some backtracking parts here and there. Moving on to point 4 on my list, I would also like to have less but therefore bigger shrines in Breath of the Wild 2, because I generally liked the idea of the shrines being sort of like mini dungeons where each shrine had a few rooms that you have to go through and solve small challenges in. However, I think some of the shrines were really short in the first game. There were some shrines that were literally just made out of one single puzzle or one single room. And also, there was a lot of repetition throughout the entire world. There were several shrines where you had to fight a guardian. There were several shrines where you had to solve an overworld puzzle, and the shrine was basically just a room with an orb in it. And I think it would really make more sense to have less shrines, but therefore make the individual shrines more unique and also a little bit longer. The next thing is something I also kind of missed in Breath of the Wild, comparing it to other Zelda games, and that is that I have to collect heart pieces. Going in the shrines and getting orbs that you can then just exchange for additional health or stamina was, in my opinion, not as fun as really getting those heart pieces from solving puzzles all around the world, finding them in random hidden treasure chests, or winning them for being good at some mini games in the world. And I'd like to have that system back in Breath of the Wild 2, where heart pieces and maybe also stamina pieces or whatever are actually rewards for different challenges in the game. Another thing that I'd like to see in the next Breath of the Wild would be more variety in cities and NPCs, because in Breath of the Wild there were a lot of cities, and of course each of these cities was built a little bit different. However, the general feeling of all of those cities was the same, because the cities usually had the same purpose. There was a few shops in there for you to buy things in. There was usually a few NPCs with some side quests, and also the NPCs themselves that you met along the way usually just had one of a few different purposes. They were either members of the Year clan, or the NPC was stealing you some food, or you could save them from enemies and they would give you something in return or something like that. And of course, I understand that it's easier to have a few NPC behaviors and have multiple NPCs with the same behavior in the world, rather than giving each NPC a unique behavior. However, I still think that at least some more variety would make a difference in Breath of the Wild 2. Now the next point is probably something more personal wish than something that I could imagine also other people wish for. But what I personally would really like to see in the next game is more areas like Hyrule Castle and the Trial of the Sword areas from Breath of the Wild 1, because those were two of my favorite areas in the first game. Because for Hyrule Castle, the kind of maze-like structure, I really liked it, because even after going back to Hyrule Castle for the 10th or 20th time, even after 2 or 3 years, I still sometimes find some crack in a wall that I haven't found before, so there's always something new to explore. Other than that, the Trial of the Sword area I really liked, because it is basically like starting a new game in the game, because all of your inventory, your weapons and everything gets taken from you, and you basically have to start farming everything from scratch. Moving on to one of the few things that I didn't like about Breath of the Wild 1 is the way they handled storytelling. Of course, it is challenging to have a chronological story in an open world game, because you can go anywhere you want, in any order you want. But the way they did it was just to have these memories that to me felt like random disconnected pieces of information. They all happened at some point in the past, but there was no real chronological order. And yeah, that kind of felt weird to me. What I would prefer in Breath of the Wild 2 is to maybe have some kind of storytelling that also depends on your actions, so multiple paths or endings for the story depending on where you go at what point in time. Because, for example, another thing that from the logical point of view really bothered me in Breath of the Wild was the fact that you can go anywhere at any point, but no matter if you go to Hyrule Castle 5 minutes after leaving the Great Plateau, or if you go there 100 hours after leaving the Great Plateau, Zelda is somehow always able to hold Ganon back exactly until the point where you enter the final boss room. And I mean, of course, it's a video game, but it just doesn't really make sense. So maybe having different endings, good endings, bad endings, whatever, or in between paths of the story that depend on what you actually do in the world would be great, because I think that would also give some meaning to the things that you do in the world, because that's another downside of having a kind of disconnected story. No matter what you do or when you do something, it always results in the same ending, so it doesn't feel like anything you do even has any impact in the world. Already going to point 9 on the list, what I also like to see is some kind of diving mechanic or some way to explore the underwater world, because that was one of the only places that you couldn't really explore in Breath of the Wild 1. You could only swim on the surface of the water, but there was no such thing as diving. And usually underwater areas are not very popular in video games. However, I think that they are not generally a bad thing. It depends on how they are implemented, because, for example, I really liked the underwater parts of both Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze and Ori and the Blind Forest, and I think this is mostly due to the way they implemented the underwater movement, because in both of those games you could move rather fast through the water, and also you could move at a free 360-degree angle. And I think those are two key factors that make underwater movement and exploration also fun, because, for example, in Super Mario, the water movement is usually very slow compared to the movement on the ground. And you can also just go up and down. You cannot really control the swimming of Mario that freely. So I think that's why in Mario, water levels are maybe not that popular, but I think they still can be if done right, and I'd really like to see something like that in Breath of the Wild 2. And last but not least, the last point on my list is something that I don't think it's very likely to actually be in the final game, but what I think would also be a cool addition is to have some kind of online stuff that doesn't necessarily mean a multiplayer mode. What I think would fit to Zelda probably also very well would be some kind of online leaderboards. So for example, if you take Super Mario Odyssey, for most of the mini games that you could play in this game, there were online leaderboards that you could view and where you could compare your times and scores to the ones from the other players around the world. And I think something like that would really be cool for Breath of the Wild, because there are lots of different mini games spread around the world. However, in Breath of the Wild, there's not really any good reason to actually play them. I mean, you get a few rupees as reward if you do good, but there is no comparison to times of other players, and I think having those online leaderboards for those mini games would really give them some more meaning and more replayability. Maybe combining this with the idea that I mentioned before about having more areas like the Trial of the Sword, it would also be possible to have something like an endless mode for Trial of the Sword, where you continuously get randomly generated rooms that will keep getting more and more difficult until you eventually die at some point, and then the high score for the highest number of rooms could, for example, also be something that is tracked in an online leaderboard. And another idea is to have some weekly or monthly quests in the game that would work in a way that when you start the quest, you always spawn at a certain location in the world. You get a certain number of hearts and a certain start inventory, and from that point on, you have to fulfill certain goals. For example, get 25 apples, defeat a Lionel, and make your way to Gerudo City as fast as possible. And the overall time for that quest would then also be something that you could track on a leaderboard and compare to other times. that's it. Those are the top 10 things that I'd like to see in Breath of the Wild 2. And don't get me wrong, I don't expect them all to be in the game, or even a few of them. I think Breath of the Wild was already a fantastic game, and I would definitely also buy Breath of the Wild 2 if it was basically just the same game, but a new world to explore. However, I still think if Nintendo implements a few of the things I mentioned in this list, Breath of the Wild 2 could be even better than Breath of the Wild 1. So please also let me know what you think in the comments. Do you maybe have some other ideas that I didn't even consider in this list? So that's it for today, and I hope you enjoyed the video.